Global Christianity and the Transformation of Dalits in Colonial and Postcolonial Kerala. Professor P.K. Michael Taragan, Chairperson KCHR, will be chairing the program. Welcome, sir. The talk will be delivered by Professor P. Sanal Mohan. Professor Sanal Mohan is currently teaching at the School of Social Sciences, Mahatma Gandhi University, and he was the director of the KCHR till like 10 days back. We have been sorely missing him in the institution, and we are very happy to have him here to speak with us. And may I request you to kindly keep your mics on mute while the speaker is delivering the talk. And during the question answer session, I would request you to either type in your names or the question in the comment box, which will be addressed one by one until we have time, until we'll take up the questions till we have the time, as many questions as that can be taken. So I request Professor Michael Taragan to kindly take over the proceedings.
Hello. Hello.
Yes, sir, you're audible.
Dr. Rachel Varghese, Professor Sanal Mohan, and friends. I'm extremely nervous because I'm not at all used to speaking electronically like this to others, and I'm quite nervous. So what I suggest, of course, I would like to thank Professor Sanal Mohan for agreeing to deliver this lecture. And as I've been following his work for quite a long time, I have no doubt in saying in advance that any talk by Sanal Mohan on any part of modern Indian social and economic history, and particularly in this special field in which he'll be presenting his paper today, will not be bad. I mean, I'm just putting it in the most colloquial terms. Now, what I'll do is that I welcome Professor Sanal Mohan personally to this group, and you may go ahead and make your presentation. By the time I think I'll work up enough courage to enter more meaningfully in the discussions. At the end, probably I would express my own response or my own feelings on the subject. So, Professor Sanal Mohan, you may kindly speak.
Thank you very much, respected Chairman, Professor Michael Taragan, my colleagues former colleagues at KCHR, and other friends who have joined in this conversation this afternoon. And thanks, Rachel, for having me, and also for the kind of description that you gave of me as of my work and so on. So once again, thanking everyone. It's also a different situation for me as well to speak to people without seeing them. Obviously, I see some of these faces here, and I hope I'm audible. And I wish to state that the work which I am presenting this afternoon, something which is a work in progress, and portions of which actually I have been working for some time. And this is largely part of work on Dalits and global Christianity. And some sections of this, I mean, not sections of the one which I am presenting this afternoon, but portions that will evolve as a monograph, which is what I am now working on, has been published elsewhere. So you might find some kind of crossover. But anyway, I'm sure that I will be focused more on the question that I want to explore in this webinar. Okay, so I have titled my talk as Global Christianity and the Transformation of Dalits in Colonial and Postcolonial Kerala. So this, in fact, allows me to even look at some variants of the Pentecostal movements today. So therefore, I wish to have a broad brushstroke of global Christianity as it had a tryst or an interface with Dalits in Kerala. This is the main area of my focus. And well, the chronology is roughly from the early decades of the 19th century. So I have divided this paper into three parts. So first one is a brief introduction to Christianity in Kerala, which I'm sure could be familiar to most people who are part of this conversation. Then I go on to discuss some important issues connected with the phase of the missionary, what I call as missionary interface, and particularly with Dalit communities. And then I look at the current debates among historians and social anthropologists who work in this area. And then I open up some of the issues that I thought are central to the way I think about this. This is the structure of the presentation which I'm having now. Now, as the small introductory note has announced, so I'm just focused on, to begin with, the transforming power of the Word of God, which was, in certain ways proclaimed globally the very essence of Christianity. And elsewhere, I tried to follow the effects of this Word of God, the transforming power of Word of God in a contextualized situation, as somebody from social sciences would do. That's what I did. And there, what I am looking at is primarily what happens when the Word of God becomes available. What happens to the everyday life of people? So, as I have been focused on Dalit communities, my empirical details or the examples that I would give might come from that. So, meanwhile, Rachel, I have a question to you. So, how long do I, take? This is 3:10 now. Rachel, can you hear me?
So you can speak till hello. So you can speak till like 40 minutes, say 4 o'clock is the same.
Okay, thank you. Okay, so to quickly to move
Thank
on. So as I said in the first part, I talk about broadly giving an introduction to the Christianity in Kerala, which of course is, as I said, known to most people. But what I want to say is that, as again it is known, Christianity in its various forms in the sense that denominational or the ritual forms or the sort of rites which have been followed, we could say that it has always been global in certain ways, because if you really look at the connected histories of the Indonesian societies, then you find the very interesting circulation of languages, ideas, and so on, which is an area, as we know, historians have been plumbing for quite some time. And therefore, uh, on the southwestern coast of India, that's Kerala, we find, for example, Syriac language existing for a very long time. So therefore, the coming of Syriac language, I'm not going into the histories of that particular period. What I would suggest is that the coming of this language would definitely show the kind of cultural transactions which were very much there. And even as Christianity remained as a particular kind of sect, or subsequently in Kerala as another variant of caste, we come across the coming of these languages and cultural productions and the circulation of ideas and imaginations, therefore making it in certain ways global from the very early times. So I used to think that, because there is a lot of controversies around the question of whether St. Thomas came or not. I'm not going into that. Nor is it my area of specialization. I always think that it's quite beautiful thing to think about Kerala as having these non-Indic religions that have been in certain ways customized as Indic religions over the last several centuries. So this I find as absolutely fascinating kind of thing, which will definitely go with what I said, the kind of cultural reproductions that were made available through the circulation of ideas and languages. And yeah, so we have these iconic places, what we call as Kodungalur or Kranganur, mostly is that area, which, and again, Kollam, which was again one of those very significant places where we have some of this early documentation in relation to Christianity was available. And yeah, so then it goes without saying that these early communities, if that word is okay, acceptable, they came as part of a trade, or this was part of the, in certain ways, the worldviews of the traders who came and settled down here. But even there, we do find certain kind of globality in operation. Now, as we move on to the subsequent centuries, so we reach the era of the Portuguese, and we all know that the Portuguese were, in fact, the Europeans were really surprised to know about these early beginnings of Christianity in a part of the world where probably it was not thought of. So therefore, it was very curious in certain ways to take note of the existence of these older Christian communities over here. And in the 16th century, we have instances of this Synod of Diamper, etc. Those are interesting events, chronologically significant when we look at the Catholic variant of uh, uh, Christianity coming and establishing in Kerala. Obviously, we had an Eastern tradition of Christianity for a very long time. And now what I'm suggesting is that we have these very interesting histories of Christianity coming, and some of those significant events, such as that of Synod of Diamber, would tell us the ways in which different forms of worship, different forms of church power, different forms of political power impacted in the native society, or got established on the coastal towns of Kerala at that point of time. Then subsequently we have the Dutch also coming in with a variant of Dutch Reformed Church, which is a Protestant church, and they did exist, and they continued with the kind of religious religious life, or establishing a certain kind of religious life world of their own, but quite different from what the Portuguese did. So therefore we find, I'm not saying that there was a continuity, because these denominations were different, but we find, in spite of these differences, the existence of a substantial body of Christians in Kerala at that point of time. But one could definitely identify different variants of the faith and faith practices existing. Now, we have a traditional Christian community, then we have the Catholic Christians coming in, and the Dutch Reformed Church, at least for the purposes of the soldiers, or those who were in the garrisons in question, this sort of things must have existed. But we come across references to, for example, Catholics in the islands of Cochin bringing, for example, Palaya's under their influence. And we have a small, I think, little over 500 members from the Pulaya community becoming Christians. So these are well-known stories documented by the Portuguese, and then in translation we get it in English, the books of people like Professor Matthias Muldaden. So what I'm suggesting is that probably from the early colonial times, we've come across some sections of Dalits, not in any substantial numbers, becoming part of this global Christian transactions and networks. But obviously their conditions must have been really different, because it has been it has been pointed out by this Portuguese chroniclers that in the Cochin Islands, those Pulayas who became Christians never had a communion with the upper caste, who were part of the congregation, and even they had December 26th as their Christmas day of Christmas celebration, etc. So all of these are quite well available to us. Now, what I want to say is that in the native society, as we see, especially the traditional Christians, because this is a part of the world where probably there existed a very older form of Christianity before the Europeans arrived. And therefore, for analytical and practical purposes, we need to make a line of demarcation. These traditional Christians refer to themselves as St. Thomas Christians. And from whatever historical accounts we have, including the sort of primary sources, primary as well as secondary sources, I presume that they existed as another caste, not necessarily. Obviously, they had their own liturgical practices, etc., etc. But then, in an actual practice, in terms of the practices of the everyday life, they must have existed as another caste. So, having said this, I want to look at why, for example, I just want to foreground, I just want to say why I use global Christianity, the term global Christianity. I'm using global Christianity in order to signify the plurality of the churches, including their theological and ecclesiastical structures, as well as the point of origin of all this. Now, for example, if we read comparatively the histories of colonialism or histories of all Christianity and so on, then we find that this whole idea of globality was very much there, as I said, right from the beginning of Christianity and through the ages. But by the end of 18th century, with the coming of petty movements induced, the petty movement induced missionary organizations that had a very different kind of orientation towards this whole idea of propagating the Christian faith. Now, for my purpose, I identify this globality is quite significant. So therefore, we have these histories of Church Missionary Society, which is towards the fag end of 18th century, which is again, we do have the other significant organization, London Missionary Society, which is again towards the end of the 18th century, working as very important in, let's say, uh, global organizations, because I mean, reading of the transactions of these missionary societies would tell us that, well, they were, I used to think that probably in certain aspects, they were not far behind the East India Company if you compare the kind of work, not necessarily in terms of the financial worth, the aggregate financial worth of these institutions, but in terms the transformative powers that these missionary organizations had. Probably they were much ahead of the East India Company. But in terms of the financial worth and other kinds of things, obviously below the East India Company. But if we actually look at the ways in which they worked, then it becomes really substantial. And these days, because of the open archival systems that are available, anybody can check any of these missionary magazines published in the 19th century. We interestingly come across stuff published on Africa, and a few pages later, we find reports on Travancore or South India in general, and Travancore in particular. Or a few pages before that, you have reporting on New Zealand, or subsequently you have reporting on North India. So what I want to suggest is this: if you read these missionary journals, we find that these missionary organizations were truly global, working among absolutely different and disparate cultures, cultures that were spatially and temporally separated, cultures that never met. And we get very interesting comparative materials being circulated. So, for example, when talking about the practice of polyandry existing among, for example, pariahs in Travancore, the missionary who worked among this particular community actually took an example from the Maori community, among the practice among the Maoris in New Zealand. And then he wanted to know how this question of polyandry was resolved, for example, among the Maoris. Or again, when it comes to polygamy, they take similar examples to how the missionaries based in such context resolve this, what they would refer to as unchristian practices or quote unquote pagan practices, etc., etc. So my point is simply this: why I brought in this examples. I brought in these examples to show that in their everyday activities, in their understanding of the world, in their interpretations of histories, in their efforts to generate knowledge on totally different and differentiated communities, they did follow certain kinds of practices which in today's parlance could be definitely referred to as global in their reach. So therefore we have very interesting kind of narratives, comparisons of various aspects of human social life, and of course of religious life as well, from these writings. So these examples, so the first one which I gave was some kind of reference to the financial side. Forget about that. You can bring in this cultural examples also to show that how interestingly these organizations moved and worked like great global organizations, and obviously they generated quite a different trajectory of power when they interacted with the local communities over there. So these examples I'm giving to show how global this, this form of organizations have been, and through their work, in certain ways, we find that Christianity itself became very global. And I should say that this is in the context of modern history I'm speaking about. I'm not saying that it was not global before that. Now, so what happens now when this sort of change is taking place? So I told you about, this is again something which is known to people, about the kind of archiving or the production of knowledge that have taken place on different social practices. If it is on India, obviously they have been writing a great deal about the practice of caste in various parts of India. We do have a lot of narratives on the South India, where probably for reasons that were historical, uh, the existence of a indigenous Christianity here, we find European missionaries concentrating more on this part of the world. On South India, and therefore we have much more writing. Perhaps I need to really make a comparison, because some of my friends doing the histories of the different social groups in the northern part of India. So I used to tell them that why don't they look at the missionary archive? Very few, I think, except some historians based in Delhi University. Yeah, so we don't have many people using. I'm trying to recollect the name. It's Charugupta's work. If you look at on the north, we find that Dr. Gupta was using a lot of this missionary archive, but not many historians from the north, even those who write on caste. I am yet to see them using the missionary archives in a substantial way. But interestingly enough, those who are based in the Western institutions, historians, social anthropologists, and so on, they do use that sort of materials. Yeah. So why I mentioned this is to show, to say that for a different reason, we find a lot more writing on the different social practices, social groups, cultural, practices, etc., in the south of India in these missionary writings. So, therefore, what will happen is that there is a huge production of knowledge and a circulation of this. Elsewhere, when I wrote about slavery, I have argued that the agrestic caste slavery of South India, including that of Kerala, became a global issue through the writings of these missionaries. And we have absolutely great numbers of transactional reports, and also the everyday and daily reporting of missionaries where caste slavery figured in a very, very substantial manner, and which used to be really circulated in the international circuits, where you have anti-slavery activism flourishing, etc., etc. So therefore, my point is just this. In terms of production of knowledge, in terms of the economic transaction as well, which I have just mentioned in the case of East India Company and the missionary organizations, we find this globality existing in a big way. Now, in the second part, so I just cut short the details of that. So I'm just looking at what are the issues that are being discussed today among social scientists. Now, unfortunately, in India, this is always caught up in certain kind of politics. I mean, of course, history is not outside politics. Every word that we write in history obviously becomes political. But what I'm saying is that sometimes we find this as driven from a state-centric politics, where most of the arguments are directed from an absolutely prejudiced premises, which actually doesn't allow us to have any substantial scholarly work in this area, or issues, really do not open up to bring in fresh questions. So this is, I think, one of the limits of these debates which have taken place in India. And obviously, there are scholars who work on these issues, but I think, to my knowledge, many of them did work. I mean, even those Indians who worked in this particular area, I guess they worked when they were outside the country, a lot of them. And those who continue to work in this area, they continue to be, located institutionally elsewhere. And so therefore we have a substantial scholarship. I just have in my mind, among the Indian scholars, we have very substantial work of Saurabh Dubey, for example. He's an anthropologist and historian. So he has been writing about, especially about the north of the country, the sort of Christianity among the Adivasi communities. And Charugupta's name I just mentioned. So we have similar people who worked in this area. Or if you look at the South India, we have David Morse, who worked among the Catholic Dalits in Tamil Nadu. And he showed how significant, that's what his arguments become very, very crucial. So David Morse showed in his work how significant was Christian faith to the Catholic Catholic Dalits there, which included the Parayas also, which is one of those numerically very significant communities. And not to speak of the book by Satyanathan Clark, where he brought in the image of the drum, the Paraya drum, to talk about how significant was the engagement of Parayas with Christianity. And this particular, the sound of the drum is equated with, the kind of liberatory undertones that, the drum actually stands for, in a very interesting way, the community and so on. And then this whole idea of salvation, which missionary Christianity tried to propagate or tried to circulate, then it gets reworked in the everyday practice of the Pariah. So we do have younger generation scholars. I think some of them are theologians who work in this area and try to extend this argument. And therefore, what I want to suggest quickly is that we have scholars who have worked on South India, including Chandra Mallampalli and many others are there. But obviously, they have been writing about, this particular variant of Christianity, which was there in South India, and which actually showed this globality in its, not just in its everyday existence, but in the level of knowledge production about the community, about social life, about even the rights and everyday communion, and whatever we identify as significant everyday practices within Christianity. So we find a very great engagement of these theologians, historians, and anthropologists as far as South India is concerned. Now, some of these, I guess, some of these scholars did really interact with. For example, the scholarship which exists, for instance, on South America as well as Africa. So I have come across very interesting kind of histories and anthropologies of Christianity among the Native Americans, for example, and prophetic movements, etc. As much as we read about, for example, prophetic movements among the Native Africans. So what I'm saying is that in today's academic situation, we have scholars. I may mention the name of John and Jean Komarov, who wrote extensively on this question, who conducted research in Southern Africa, and writing about, the questions of revelation and revolution. So they have been talking about the need for understanding. Obviously, there are questions where they bring in along with this capitalism and complicating the argument, because in this part of the world we are familiar with missions being equated with colonialism, or in other words, there was a certain kind of very tenuous kind of relationship between colonialism and the global missions. But within that, in spite of this tenuous relationship, we find certain ways in which, in many parts of the world, the native societies engaged with forms of what is being referred to as modernity, which came along with colonialism, which came along with Christianity and so on. So therefore, maybe at some point of time, scholars might be talking about new semiotic practices. This is Webb Kane, is an American anthropologist writing on Sumbunese Christianity in Southeast Asia. So he has been referring to this. Or, for example, what is the significance of translation? The translation of text. Now, give an example, especially when we look at the language ideology that anthropologists who work on Christianity actually come up with. They do say that what exactly is the question of translation involved in all this? We have, for example, Hebshiba Israel's work on translation of Bible into Tamil. She has a fantastic book where actually she takes up this. Or the writings of Bernard Bates, the late anthropologist Bernard Bates, who actually tried to study Tamil language and the oratorial skills of Tamil politicians, which was, I think, his subsequent sort of writing. But before that, he did a lot of work on the evangelical movement in Tamil Nadu, and through that, in those works, he tried to show how these evangelists, many of them came from Dalit communities or the poor OBC background and so on. So they created a condition where Tamil language could be used very, very differently, quite different from that of the upper caste in Tamil Nadu. So therefore, we need to look at this language ideology that worked. So how did language ideology work when Christianity was translated? Because when you talk about a religion, especially these global religions, we actually come across the translation of not just text. So, for example, a Protestant text like the Book of Common Prayer, which I guess was translated fully into Malayalam in 1848, and it was exactly the same year in which this was translated into Yoruba language in Nigeria. So I tried to look at this, the secondary literature on translation of the Book of Common Prayer. So what will happen is that when you look at these examples, what we come across is a very fascinating story of concepts and categories being translated across cultures. And therefore, this is one direction in which the current research is taking place, or current research in the sense that if I look at some of these books of Revelation and Revolution by Jean and John Komarov, 2-volume works which were published, one in the late 90s and subsequently the second volume in the early 2000s. And there are many of their students who worked on different aspects of African Christianity subsequently. And also, if you look at a book like Tales of Faith by Mudimbe, he's a very celebrated African social scientist and philosopher. He actually talks about the ways in which, in Cameroon, for example, the translation of Christianity has taken place. So I just tried to follow these debates including that of the kind of writings which I came across in the Pacific Islands, where both Catholic and Protestant Christianities were very strong, or the writings on Papua New Guinea, where Protestants were actively involved in translating Bible into the native language. And then they do talk about this linguistic ideology as very, very significant. So therefore, I just want to signpost this whole idea that the question of language translation, linguistic ideology, and things of that kind. That's an area where we have a lot of research is taking place. The other one is to talk about the process of commodification and modernity that redefined the indigenous communities. I mean, which is again a global thing. So therefore, this is another area where we have a lot of scholars working. And then we have writings on oppositional movements, social and religious movements that went against the credo of Christianity, even as many of these movements would draw from the fundamentals of Christianity. They would critically engage with those ideas and transform them, and would make them part of the the social and religious movements. So we have the British anthropologist Matthew Engelke, who has a very fantastic thesis about the genre Christians in southern part of Africa, who thought that they were getting revelation live and direct from God. So there is no need of God. There is no need of even they would say that Jesus, and also the scriptures, the Bible. So they would say that they would get sort of revelation live and direct from the high. So, and yes, now the other side of the spectrum is quite interesting, where people have been writing more about colonial culture and its how Christianity inflects this. That's a very interesting area where right from the 1970s, people have been talking about cargo cults, etc., etc. And yes, the global dimension of Christianity has again remained as a very significant thing, to the extent that people like Peter van der Veer had argued that there was, as far as global Christianity was concerned, he would say that it was more like conversion to modernity. So therefore, these arguments remain as very, very important when we look at the current debates. Now, quickly I move on to what do we have more about this Indian side. So those of us, since we are based in Kerala, or I'm talking about this Kerala situation, we have people like O.D. Forrester, Duncan B. Forrester, Gladstone, Robert Illich, Dick Kuyman, and so many others who wrote about this, including most recent writings of George Uman and many others on Kerala, especially looking at this interface of Dalits and Christianity. So now, what I found as quite interesting is, although they all of them talk about social change, absolutely important, but we do find a problem with, for example, what happens to people when they really have this new phase? What happens to them? How did they understand it? How did this translation take place? And how did, in fact, the people thought of these ideas that they have acquired from, the missionaries who came and taught them, etc., etc. So there. Without taking too much time, I wish to state that it is important to look at how these ideas actually transform the people. That's where I began with saying that. That's why I began with saying that it's important to talk about what happens when the word gets circulated. So therefore, the power of the word becomes really significant. So therefore, we are being invited to have an idea about the internal deliberations of the people. and which is again something connected with their mentality and so on. So I did some work in the area of Christian missions and emotions, and how this is a paper which I published last year, where I actually tried to look at these emotional aspects of that, and how in fact there is a shared realm where there's a shared area where we have the emotions of the missionaries and the emotions of the people involved, the missionaries, and the emotions of those who were supporting those missions from the metropolitan centers really came together. And I actually continued to work this particular theme, and early this year, I think it was towards the end of 2019 December, I did publish something related to subaltern public sphere and Dalits, where I actually tried to look at this commingling of the emotional world of the missionized Dalits and the missionaries, as well as the metropolitan people. So these are some of the areas where today we have these researchers are progressing. Now, let me go back to the globality of this. And now, for example, why I have brought in this idea of globality, it is largely because of the fact that even as we had a variant of Christianity here in Kerala, we hardly come across, the traditional Christian church that existed here as a missionizing church, a church that was into the sort of piety, missionary movement, and taking the word of God to the people, because it was the engagement with the written word was different. Now, obviously, it was not a highly literate society, and the practice of reading the scriptures were not there. So, therefore, there were a lot of limitations that we need to identify here. But when Buchanan visited here, we know that he encounters this uh, native Christians, and he was obviously much fascinated. And eventually, we know that he comes across, Bible in the Syriac language, and that was, in fact, I think, a very, very significant moment. Because the cultural transactions that I have referred to, there, which was existing in Kerala, this region of the world, much earlier, gets re-articulated with this sort of encounter of European Christian intellectual and a bureaucrat based in India with the native Christians. And now, if we look at the sort of globality which has been developing from that point onwards, we hardly find Dalits becoming part of that. I think Dalits became part of that, thank you, only quite subsequently, in the sense that from the middle of the 19th century onwards, from the middle of the 19th century, when, for example, Reverend George Mathen, when as he was encouraged by Reverend Ragland, who visited Travancore, who saw the slaves, etc. These are stories which are known to people who do research in the area of Christianity, Protestant Christianity in Kerala. Reverend Ragland, who was a fellow of St. John's College in Cambridge, so he asked Reverend Mathen, who was based in Malapalli at that point of time, to work among these people. So then the narratives which are familiar to many people today would tell us how the teaching began to take place. So that's the point to which I should connect myself. That's when the word of God began to be translated. Although, if you read the letters of Benjamin Bailey and others, so I chanced to read some of those original letters where, in fact, he talks about the necessity of taking the translated portions of the scriptures to the students of the old seminary in Kottayam. And in one of his letters, he says that, well, this was just during the monsoon, the students have gone home, and he was waiting for them to come back so that he could give to them the portions of the scriptures he had already, finished translating. And then if we follow the subsequent letters, we find that uh, it was a great zeal of these missionaries to translate these texts into Malayalam. And I tried to follow up these debates, but unfortunately, I could not come across the manuscripts of the actual work of translation. The stuff that I thought must have survived. Maybe it is somewhere there. I couldn't locate this even in the Bible collections of the library at the University of Cambridge. Although they have 2,000 Bible in 2,000 languages, they do have a lot of varieties of Bible in Malayalam as well. But we hardly come across those notes on which these missionaries had actually worked. That would have given us a great deal of ideas about the ways in which the Word of God was translated in the local context. But as we read today the text, and also look at the narratives that are available in other forms, we know that this power of the word was really significant. Like, for example, this is something which I did publish earlier. The sort of notions on sin. I don't want to go into those things. I wish to bring in some of these things which I have not actually dealt with in my published materials. Now the question is, I just want to what I want to open up is how, for example, how, for instance, the Word of God was when it was rendered into a local language. What sort of uh, ideas that really guided the selection of words for each of those phrases, because that's at one level this is the business of translation, but another level obviously it is a matter of cultural translation. People who are not really into something similar to the kind of Christian notion of sin, how will you identify, or sorry, how will you really tell them that, look, this is not the way you need to understand this? So there are so many such things that we can take up here. And the same thing about the Book of Common Prayer. Because this is a very foundational text, although it's not the scriptures, but then we have rendering of scripture in a particular way, and obviously those in English literature studies would know that this is a very important text as far as English language is concerned. But when this is translated into Malayalam, what does it mean to the ordinary folks who chanced upon the portions of this text? So we did a lot of research on the question of prayer among Dalit communities, and we did come across elderly people, interviewing them and asking them how did they really understand these concepts. I mean, these are third generation people. Obviously, they are not the first generation who really learned it from the European missionaries. These are people who actually read these books, and who would be repeatedly singing the hymns which are part of this and which are part of the everyday worship. And now the question is how this everyday language gets inflected. So if we follow the everyday usages, everyday languages of people who were missionized, especially from the slave caste communities, then you find, as anthropologists of Christianity would tell us, that here is an example of linguistic modernity which has taken shape, which has taken place in a very substantial manner. People, really trying to acquire a new language, new modes of expressions, new phrases, and new forms of articulation. And now these new forms of articulations quite well, it is my hunch, because I don't have real historical sources to speak on this, could have been articulated in the sermons, homilies, and public speeches. Now, I just recall the name of the late with the professor Bernard Bates, who worked on the Tamil region. So who talked about, Bates' important work is on Tamil language as it is used by the Tamil politicians. We know from, as of all of us in the South India would know that among the Tamils, language is really significant. And the very felicity of language, expressions, the way they use, although I don't understand Tamil, I read it from historical research materials that those things are absolutely important. I do not know if we have a similar study on Malayalam language, and how the rhetoric is very, very, if it is significant for Malayalam. We don't have social scientists doing that sort of research. Now, Bernard Bates, when he studied Tamil language, he said, well, Tamil language has a lot of, things that they have taken from the cultural and literal translations of these Christian texts. And that has created a particular level of discourse, a particular level of language use among the ordinary folks. And he, in his articles and books, have reproduced a lot of similar Tamil passages, Tamil hymns, and so on. And in fact, my friend and colleague Vinil Paul once told me that, in fact, Adimavela Orinyu, that song, which is translated into English and made part of Native Life in Travancore by Samuel Matthew, which was in fact written by a Tamil evangelist in Tamil, and then it was translated into Malayalam and eventually translated into English. So within the native, this missionary tradition, we find that sort of translations taking place. And let me go back to what I was saying. So these sermons, homilies, and public speeches, we do not have the text of them. So whereas when I read histories from other parts of the world about the histories of missions and their interface with the local communities, I come across a variety of, sermons, a variety of homilies, etc., which actually tells us how the native pastors or catechists or the ordinary folks, not talking about those who are really ordained, pastors or people of that kind. I'm talking about the ordinary folks who really interacted with people in the local communities, and we do come across a great deal of very sophisticated documentation on them, which unfortunately we don't have as far as Kerala is concerned. And what I have come across is again in the reports of these missionaries like George Martin and many others whose original manuscripts I had occasion to read. They do talk about, interestingly, about the sermons. But these are written in English, actually, because these are the reports they have sent to the headquarters of the CMS. And even the kind of stuff which I have seen from the LMS also, including that of Salvation Army, that I happen to see. So we don't get this sort of things. And now quickly, so therefore what I want to say is this. When you want to study this globality of transformation of Dalit communities due to Christianity in colonial and post-colonial Kerala, we really need to look at this language ideology and how it works and so on, and then see how, for example, these ordinary folks, as I said, the pastors. In fact, you have this iconic figure of Pulaya Ubadeshi in Paul Chirakarod's Pulayatara. So, and in fact, some of our friends would say that that was his father himself, who was a pastor, or as we call in Malayalam as Ubadeshi. And now look at the way he is being, his image is being created in that novel. He comes out as an absolutely living character in the novel, where he has acquired this felicity of language, composing songs and giving extempore talks, extempore lectures on themes based in the Bible, based on the Bible, or the themes drawn on the scriptures. So therefore, this is one something which we need to know, how this language translation, how the cultural translation, etc., takes place. Now, quickly in the remaining time, what I want to say is that when it comes to, I don't have time to go into all the details, the post-colonial times, I always thought that one interesting thing is to look at, for example, the histories of the Pentecostal movements in Kerala. Now, obviously, a lot of people have written about it, and we have our young colleagues. In fact, one of the student who worked with me, who is our colleague now, Dr. Mohan, who wrote a fantastic thesis on Dalit Pentecostal Christianity in Kerala, which was submitted to the University of Hyderabad. Now he talks about how he tried to link up with the question of public sphere and Dalit Pentecostals in Kerala. Now, if you really extend the arguments which I have presented here, then we definitely know that in post-colonial context, or right from, let's say, from the late 30s onwards. Obviously, if you look at the history of Pentecostal churches in Kerala, right from the very beginning of Pentecostalism, we have a lot of Dalits who are part of this and who are really invested into this. And then in the subsequent splits, etc., we have one section of Pentecostals becoming exclusively of Dalits, and then leave out that bigger church, we have smaller Pentecostal churches where you have exclusively Dalit congregation. So what happens here is that today they do publish a lot of stuff. Actually, there are a lot of sermons, there are a lot of homilies, there are a lot of songs which are being printed and circulated by these people. I have in my mind the publications of churches like WME, which is a small, I mean, it's not a small church in that sense. It's a really big when you compare Pentecostal churches. So, but they do have a very impressive kind of publication, which tells us that, look, these people are taking stuff from the scriptures and, reinterpreting them in certain ways, theologians in action, trying to see what sort of things are happening in society and the need to change, and the way this scriptural language could be used for changes, not just social changes. Obviously, it has a very substantial part to play in the yeah. In terms of changing the ideas, in terms of changing their mentality, and of course the religious life. Now, my last point in relation to this is that when it comes to smaller Pentecostal churches, and the dynamism is very different because ordinary folks are allowed to be pastors and they are able to read the scriptures and interpret them. And therefore, when you look at this particular variant of Christianity, then you find that there is a very substantial engagement with the written word, the written text. It's the circulation of ideas and the reproduction of ideas and validation of their life, both in the long term as well as in their local everyday context. And therefore, this is the sort of globality that is being reproduced in each of these village contexts. And therefore, I would conclude by saying that when I look at global Christianity, one significant aspect that I would want to talk about, which is what I did today, is to bring in the significance of Word of God. So one could look at this from a religious point of view. Obviously, that is very, very significant because we are talking about segments of society who are real believers, who believe in God or who believe in Jesus Christ, and the whole salvation, the idea of salvation which is being communicated as very serious thing. And then the other one is to see what happens when this this sort of cultural translations take place. And that is a point where you find these the individuals that I have spoken about. I can explain it further. They do exist in a global transaction of ideas and cultures. Thank you very much.
Can you hear me? This is Michael Tarakan.
Yes, sir, we can hear you.
Yeah, I presume that Professor Sanal Mohan has finished his talk.
Yes, I did. Thank you.
Sir.
Okay. Thank you very much for an excellent presentation. And uh, when I wouldn't again start speaking anything right now, I would let. I'm sure that most of you would be having a number of issues to be raised vis-a-vis Professor Sanal Mohan's presentation. So I would request all of you to um, interact with Sanal Mohan's presentation. And I would request Rachel to 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 moderate that session. Reading out the names of the people whom you know going to they're going to ask and all that. Will you do that, Rachel?
Yes, sir. Thank you, sir. I'll just take it over.
Okay, you go ahead.
Yes, sir. Thanks. Thank you, everyone. We already have a few queries here. And anyone else, if you wish to pose a question or give a comment, kindly type in either your name or the question itself. We will have 1 hour to deal with the questions and comments that come. So I will go on to the first query that has come up. It's from Christudos. Very insightful. Could you please throw some light on the crucial role played by native agents who facilitated missionary evangelization locally and quote-unquote passive informants who helped both missionaries and colonial government in creating knowledge, in actualizing this transition from a somewhat local into a global Christianity? How far localization of Christianity affected global Christianity? Professor Sanal Mohan, would you like to respond to that
Yeah,
query, or should I read it to
yeah.
you?
No, I mean, whichever is good, I can respond right now or wait for, if there are
Okay, sir.
questions, similar questions, I can wait a few
Maybe
minutes.
if you could respond to this one, and
Yeah, all
we can
right,
go to the
okay.
questions one by one.
Yeah. Thank you, Dr. Dose. And this is a very important thing. The native agents, I don't know if I'm audible. The work of native agents are really significant because these are the people who really do the job of the meeting up with. I mean, the other missionaries also do this, but then native agents do great deal of work, and they are being coordinated by the missionaries. The structure of the organization is such that if we actually look at many parts of South India, we don't see many so British or American missionaries existing there. Their numbers were limited, but then we know that these transactions have been taking place, and in that, the role of these people who are locally based become very, very important. And I think this is very true for almost all missionary organizations. Now, I'm I am not very sure whether they were actually passive informants. So what would happen is that now, since I did read some a little more closely the materials related to the Kerala region, especially the southern region of Kerala, as I read the CMS and LMS materials, uh, they do talk about some of these uh, Pulaya catechists who were really, I still remember some of those names. One guy who worked in Mundakayam, and I think he was from Irava community, and he joined the mission, and his name was Nanu. And this gentleman actually wrote a lot of interesting reports. And similarly, there was another Pulaya who wrote report. That's quite surprising because I'm not talking about the 20th century. I'm talking about roughly 1860s that time. 1860s, 70s that time. And if you have a Pulaya who is able to write a report at that point of time, that is quite substantial. We really need to look at it as a real great moment of, the interface with, the kind of coming of literacy. And look at how significant literacy is. If you look at those anthropologists who studied this, especially in the context of South, we have Kathleen Goff or Jack Goody. These are the people who did a lot of research on this particular question, and they would tell us that, well, this is a significant moment when people who were denied of this denied of this right to intellectual production, the right to intellectual production, and then you have them. You have some, at least one person from this particular group trying to engage in certain kind of reporting about their own conditions, and therefore probably I think I request you to really inverse this idea of passive informant. And they were really active, and they did translate this, as I said, these concepts and categories into the local idioms and made it available to people, etc. Now, interestingly, then there is this the whole colonial state coming up there. This is one point where I guess in India this is being taken up in a big way, and not just in India. This is true for most colonized societies, because as we all know, missionaries were, most of them were Europeans, except a few who became missionaries in the local societies from those, the people from there itself, or the natives. And the rest of them were part of the European, the contingent. And naturally, they had affinities to their own national, agendas of the nation states and so on. But at the same time, we also have missionaries who were not so much into that. They see, if you look at, in fact, I think Anuj is here in our group. He's a PhD student at University of Sanskrit at Kaladi, with whom I have been interacting a lot as an examiner. And Anuj used to tell me about the information gathering system, which he is working on Cochin State and information gathering system. And now this, if you look at this information gathering system, he talks about the policing. Whereas I'm talking about the kind of information gathering system where we have the missionaries as people providing information. Now look at the journals, Missionary Intelligencer. That's the title of one of the journals. Or you have gleanings from the field. So all these snippets, small items of information, news which were printed, then you see that missionaries really used to collect all sorts of information about the native society, and some of this information could be used by the state, absolutely no doubt about that. But at the same time, if you look at the private correspondence of many missionaries, and they were not into that sort of an arm of the imperial state. Some of them were, some of them were not, and therefore this is a conflictual kind of situation. This is, I think, a story which is quite complex. So therefore, the extent of information that they may provide to state, I don't think that all of them, worked as another arm of the police or the military and so on. But at the same time, they had their own kind of, affinities. For example, I will not take much time. These are long stories, and historians' stories are always long. And so, for example, I give you a very funny tale. It was actually not funny. It was a tale of blood and suffering. But what happens towards the end of it is that the person who was arrested by a local police official, not very far from Kottayam town, that village Kangara, then eventually he was taken to Alapura. This is sometime in 1880s. I mean, there was not so much transportation. That probably they used water transport to take this guy, and lodged him in jail there. And eventually, the missionary A.F. Page. I'm talking about the story of one of our heroes, Patros Veliappan, grandfather Patros, as he is reverentially referred to. So he was arrested and incarcerated, and eventually, after a few days, the missionary based in Kottayam came to know about it, and he went to Alapi because the missionary knew the magistrate there. Magistrate was a Brahmin magistrate. That's how he is being referred to in their writings. The missionary intervened and told this magistrate that this is a very nice person. He is a leader of his community. He suffered a lot. He himself was a slave who was sold to different landlords, who finally escaped from there, and then he became instrumental in starting Christian community of the slaves there. He was baptized by Henry Baker Jr. So there is a whole lot of narrative, highly emotionally charged sort of narrative. And eventually, through the help of this magistrate, the missionary gets him released from jail. Now, because this missionary knew that this is a graduate from the Scott Christian College, yeah, there's a missionary institution, and he knew the value of that sort of education, upbringing, and so on. So, therefore, to cut short, what I want to say is that the relationship with the state was not a very straight, linear kind of thing. There were a lot of kind of shivalis or troubles, problems, etc. Now, for the missionaries, this is something which is very substantial. This is my last point to this question. Now, if you look at the writings of missionaries in Africa, especially I read this in the books of people like John Peel and others. They do talk a great deal about the native missionaries' writing. So these are Africans writing these annual reports, weekly reports, monthly reports, and so on from the native society, and they were very much part of this, the whole missionizing job. Now, when I talk about Dalit interface with these international missionary organizations, except a few passing references to one or two Dalits who wrote these reports, we hardly come across their reports as such in the archive. It is not there. It is some kind of, I don't know if it is right to talk about them as unarchived histories, but maybe provisionally I use that word. To talk about that. But the rest of the writings by Reverend Martin or Reverend Ummen, Koshi, and you name them, you have them there in the archive. Because I have come across these writings and read them, and I know that that was a substantial body of knowledge on 19th century Travancore region. And therefore, so the native agents did play. So the people below them, people below the missionaries or the pastors who were very active, who were ordained priests of the the missionary, Anglican Church, and those ordinary folks below them, especially from the lower caste communities, they are absolutely a missing link. So therefore, informants really remained as significant. They did provide a lot, but then there is this whole question of power in knowledge production. I think that's what is really impacted here. So this is a provisional response to that. Thank you.
So the next question is from Dr. Satyaraj. In fact, he has two questions, so I will read out both of them.
Yeah.
Missionaries were seeking support for evangelization. The marginalized groups were looking for liberation and equality. The colonizers supported the missionaries with a dual interest, commitment to support evangelism and to serve colonial interests. What is your position in this argument? And the second question is, the modern medicine. Sorry, sir.
Rachel, could you please read that once again?
Yes.
I'm sorry.
Sure.
Yeah, so the support for evangelists?
Missionaries were seeking support for evangelization. The marginalized groups were looking for liberation and equality. The colonizers supported the missionaries with a dual interest, commitment to support evangelism and to serve colonial interests. What is your position in this argument? And the second query that he has is, the modern medicine that the medical missionaries brought to Kerala particularly in Travancore area, helped Dalits to think against caste pollution and marginalization. Do you agree with that?
Okay, so is what is more important is not my agreement. I guess as Mr. Satyaraj will also agree with me, the point is to really engage with these statements that he had made. Now, with modern medicine, so the question was whether Dalits benefited or not. What was that, Rachel? Modern medicine.
Yeah, it's a statement that in terms of, let me just read out that last sentence for you.
Yeah, modern medicine. What happens to modern medicine?
Caste, it helped Dalits to think against caste pollution and marginalization.
Well, I think, although I haven't done any research on this coming of modern medicine in Travancore, I happen to read a lot of archival materials of that time. For example, the reports on the Booth Hospital in Nagarkoil, I guess that, or I mean the reports of the Salvation Army, which was very big when it comes to medical mission, or the histories of the uh, LMS activities and the the Nayur hospital and the doctors based in there. They were, in fact, when I think one of the missionaries named W.S. Stephens, I guess, when he was ill, staying in Tiruvalla, the missionaries sent people to Nayur to bring in. So you can imagine how many days it must have taken for the doctors to come. So therefore, modern medicine was very much there. But if you look at the narratives, what would happen is that there are even the late colonial missions. In spite of having some more medical facilities by that time, the missionaries, when they go to the field, they will have some medicines with them for treating the poor people who are who may have a fever or diarrhea and disease of that kind. So they did carry this, and so they will have a bag with all these medicines. And if you look at the narratives on, for example, Henry Baker Jr. So he was born in here, but sent to UK for his higher studies and so on. And eventually he does a course in a medical school. So he comes back as a trained medical practitioner. Now in LMS case, I have come across, probably it is known to many people who do research on the history of LMS. At Nayur, they had trained a pariah woman as a nurse, so she was excellently trained. And in one of the nearby villages, when there was a problem for a Brahmin woman at the time of her delivery, so the men folk over there, that family sent out for help from somebody to seek help from the missionaries. And then they said, obviously, we could help. And they sent this pariah woman. And then, obviously, you don't expect this pariah woman to enter that house. And eventually, that woman dies. Yeah, this is a kind of story. And therefore, if you really look at the histories of Western medicine in that way, then you will find that obviously some sections of people, especially who really interacted with these people, they did benefit, if that was the question. Now, at the same time, I have also come across examples, especially towards the end of 19th century, when I think smallpox was claiming several lives. And nearby here in Kumaragam, here because I'm in Kottayam, that's why I say like that. We come across narratives of Pulaya pastors and catechists going and visiting people who were afflicted with smallpox. Or even I have seen the church records of the Henry Baker's church in Melugaon. So towards the end of 19th century, when I look at the burial register, we found that most people died of smallpox. So therefore, you also see examples where missionaries were not able to help much because that medicine was not available, or the wild fever and things of that kind. And therefore, medicine definitely had an effect. If that was a question, I presume that was a question. Rachel, you may correct me if I didn't get the question well. Now, about the first two parts, yes, what I have found is that if you look at the anti-colonial literature, uh, say if you read, for example, Franz Fanon and people of that kind, or I see any of those intellectuals who were leaders of anti-colonial thinking, they do talk about the double role that Christianity had played. So remember, we cannot understand this without taking into account colonialism, colonial politics, and so on. But within that, that's what I'm saying. You find the local people creating niches where they are able to experience certain kind of liberation. So, which is very, very provisional, one could say. Now, it doesn't dismantle the entire structures of colonialism. But if you look at, which is what I tried to do, following people like anthropologists like Fabian, who worked on the Congo, where he talks about the Jama movement or the Aladura movement, which are all religious movements where native Africans had a very substantial role. And people thought that they could really, evolve a life without being oppressed by colonial masters. So this was a possibility, they thought. But at the same time, when you look at the political economy of colonialism, etc., then you find that obviously the colonial state was very powerful. And this is something which has been studied by people like Lamin Sane, and many others have done this sort of research. And therefore, my response is that we need to actually look at the context and then understand the kind of, let's say, the politics which was unfolding, and the kind of responses eventually shown by the people. And the colonial state had a particular kind of interest. And obviously, those who were missionized, they also had a particular kind of interest. And there were times when they converged, and then there were times they diverged. So, therefore, I wish to state that. Evangelists had their own idea. I used to tell people, taking examples from Kerala, if they are not interested in evangelizing Kerala, there is no need of them coming, so many thousands of miles traveling across the Atlantic to reach Kerala. There was no need of that. So therefore, this sort of religion, the religious reason, rational propaganda was very, very central to them, absolutely central. But at the same time, we should also not lose sight of what was happening into the local societies. Not all local societies were egalitarian, and therefore, probably this is one of the vexatious questions or vexed questions, which has been debated by anthropologists and historians. And my submission is to look at the complexities of that and the different interests with which agents, in the field interacted. So then you are in a field of power, and you cannot dispense with that power, that dimension of power, to talk about a very innocent kind of religion. It is not. So therefore, even within religion, we need to look at the dimension of power. So that's how I look at this. Thank you.
So our next question is from Jayaji Nair.
Yeah.
A second. Yeah, you had mentioned about the tenuous relationship between colonial rulers and missionaries. Can you
Okay, what I
explain?
said, when it comes to, for example, you take the case of India when the Charter Act was revised, and I think the predominant opinion was not in favor of allowing missionaries. So subsequently, obviously the missionary opinion won. Now, if you take the case of Travancore, someone like General Cullen, for example, example. He was not so much enthusiastic about missionaries or the activities of missionaries. And even he had a very different opinion about breast cloth agitation. So I just remember reading his statement. He said, what could I do if the people over here want to wear clothes which their climate doesn't warrant them to have? See, this is a hot country. Why do you want to have all these dress materials? That's a very simplistic kind of response, one could say, which he had when the breast cloth agitation was taking place. He was not so much, fancied by the ideas of the missionaries, LMS missionaries, and others who were campaigning for this. So, therefore, you will find that on many occasions, uh, the missionaries were, the administration was not in favor of them. And then, of course, the great, cultural question. In fact, after the 1857, you find the whole debate whether they should intervene. This is one of the questions, whether they should intervene in the social affairs of India. They said absolutely not required because it's a very different society and leave it to them to resolve. So all of these problems have been there. But then when it comes to the missionized societies, like for example, I can give you any number of examples from Kerala. For instance, in I guess 1915-16, when in Koilon, Perunad, where we had this sort of conflicts between Pulayas and Parayas, you find LMS mission was caught into that because many of those LMS Christian Pulayas, their houses were attacked, they lost their clothes, and one of the missionaries based in Koilon wrote to London saying that his congregation could not return to church for 6 months until new supports. Money was sent from London along with clothes. So, because these people lost their clothes when their huts were burned down, and they could not return, and they could not even go to church. So, therefore, what is the relationship between the missionaries over there and the people? So, it is a very close kind of relationship. But then there were times when the missionaries did not have that much contact with the state as well. So that's why I said it is tenuous. But then if you look at the history of that, even someone like I guess Colonel Munro, who presumed that there will be a substantial number of Christians who would support British colonialism in Travancore. The subsequent history showed that some of them at least went away from their influence. But although they remained as beneficiaries of the institutions and systems that British colonialism brought in, they had a very different kind of relationship with that. Now, what I want to suggest is just this. So, in the colonial context, basically, I, as a student of history, would look at the agents situated in this, in this play of power, where the power is articulated. And each one was taking his or her decisions, or each sections were taking their decisions. And therefore, sometimes those decisions must have been very, very provisional. But those who became Christians, I guess, they did really think about it. So if you want to look at the mentality of people following historical source materials, then you will soon realize that that was a serious choice which people made. Thank you.
Our next query is from Professor Vinita
Say it
Menon.
again. Whose question? Oh, okay.
From Professor Vinita Menon. Very fascinating. Remembering Jean Komarov's work, Body of Power,
Yeah.
Spirit of Resistance. People on margins of South African state on fringes of modern world system. A different kind of resistance, that is of contemporary importance, arises from the racial attack on blacks in US and resistance aimed at cutting cultural categories. So identity categories are now more interesting as categories of resistance creation and deconstruction of cultural categories, both happening. Comments?
Yeah, I agree with what Professor Vinita Menon had said. So I tried to follow Jean and John Komarov through the other writings as well, including this body power and spirit of resistance and social science theory in the South and so on. So I know that theirs is a very substantial kind of substantial body of writings on the global South. Now, when it comes to, say for example, the ways in which bodies get marked, we know that in a racially segregated societies, as it is in the US, obviously the resistance happens at various levels. So at the level of everyday life, I mean, in fact, if you look at the George Floyd incident, then this is something which is reproduced in everyday life of the Black Americans or Native Americans and some sections of the immigrants, probably mostly Latinos and so on. So there we find this very treacherous kind of situation existing, making people's life really difficult. So what I want to say is that, so as I agree fully with what you said, now this body becomes completely marked in the sense that you see the when the movement Black Lives Matter or I can't breathe, when these slogans were raised, so those slogans became really global slogans, and we find this the whole debates at that point of time were centering on the question of body. If I remember it correctly, and also, if you really want to follow that, those were the times when the US was facing the worst of the Corona COVID-19 threat. But we find millions of people marching across the streets, braving the pandemic, but foregrounding the fact that, appending the fact that, the black body mattered a lot. So therefore, I think this actually showed, some kind of, not some kind of, a definite spirit of resistance in our contemporary times. But as many commentators, including Professor Rajiv Bhargava and others have pointed out, we hardly come across a similar kind of movement in India. So therefore, I think this highly embodied history of the black bodies as far as the the US is concerned, or even the Caribbeans, or we could also include Africa. Although there are black bodies in this part of the world, we hardly have these inscribed bodies coming up and talking about a different, kind of resistance, etc. So therefore, I think that's a very absolutely important observation. Thank you very much for that.
The next query is from Rennie Thomas. Hi Sanal, excellent talk. Thank you so much. I just want to ask if the usage, quote unquote, global Christianity, conceptually and historically different from quote unquote world Christianity. Existing titles such as World Christianity by scholars like Elizabeth Copping and others use world and not global, and they also teach courses titled World Christianity. Could you talk about the reasons of this shift from world to global? Or do you think these usages talk to each other? Thank you.
Yeah, so I have some familiarity with Professor Copping's work, and I use the term global Christianity in terms of the possible cultural transactions, and also the cultural translations that this had entailed. Now, obviously, one could say that, well, the term like world Christianity can also talk about this, but then one may, if I think much more, in a specific manner, what I would say is that we may want to disengage from probably specialities of an older kind. So when we talk about world Christianity, that is absolutely fine for some people. It is okay for me, although I have not used it. But then global Christianity gives me certain kind of leeway to talk about this sort of cultural translations, transactions, and how, for example, globality itself becomes something produced locally. I may draw your attention, Dr. Thomas, to which I'm sure you know, Apadure and many others have worked in this area, who would talk more about this sort of globality and the kind of reproductions that could take place. So it is in that context that I've been using this term globality. But obviously, we know that there are many scholars who have been writing about global Christianity. Now, the world Christianity, on the other hand, they do talk about transactions, cultural translations, and things of that kind. But I'm not very sure whether it sends an idea of a fixity as far as these regions are concerned. Now, the other side, which is my quick response. If I want to look at, say, for example, global economies, one of those very useful terms which we used to have is world economy. And in the world economy, we do talk about the transactions of labor, capital, and all that, but in a specialized manner, right? So we have entities like core, periphery, and all that. See, that's what we used to do in critical political economy to talk about the histories of capitalism. There, those segments where transactions take place, they don't remain as fixated segments, because these sort of divisions, the core periphery and the semi-periphery, could occur repeatedly in any part of the world, depending on the kind of economic activities. Something similar to that. So when I use this global sort of thing, and it also talks about the ways in which, as I told you, in a small village right here in Kottayam, or say, let's say, Tirunelveli, or Nagarkoil. So you can or look at the Trivandrum pastorate of the LMS Church. Something similar to that could happen in Attingel and so many other places about which we have all this writing. So look at how these global forces have been working in these places and transforming people. So this is how I thought there is some way in which I could use this term. Yeah. So the other writings I'm familiar with. Yes.
Thank you. The next question is from Manoj Ebenezer. The variant of Christianity that existed in Kerala before the arrival of Protestant missionaries never cared to engage in translation and transformation. The missionaries brought the English Bible and translated it, starting off transformations and consequences. But the St. Thomas Christians never translated the Syriac Bible until the Ramban translation of was initiated by Buchanan. Why did they make no transformative interventions on the lower castes? Why was missionary Christianity different?
You know, that's. Thank you very much. It's a very exhausting question. Uh, the, Obviously, we need to really do a lot of research to find the answers for this. Although answers might appear very near and very easy. Whereas it may not be that easy either. So one could say that, okay, these are Christians who actually shared the life world of upper caste, so-called Hindus over here. And therefore, it was, as I said, it remained mostly as a caste. And it was not an evangelical kind of religion. So probably, we need to make a distinction between this piety movements induced evangelical Christianity and the traditional church that existed here in Kerala, which was not a church committed to that sort of missionizing or evangelism and things of that kind. So probably we need to look at it as an entity which has its own kind of dynamism, rituals, prayers, and so on, and not necessarily, into the translation of scriptures and reading them and so on. Now, we also need to look at the histories of reading, for example. The availabilities of the text and the reading of the text, and how kind of a reading public would emerge. None of these existed at that point of time, and therefore the portions of scriptures that continue to exist, so they probably had a very, very limited function. Now, even I think I would request also Michael Sargan also to join. So, if you look at, for example, the 19th century and even 20th century, I don't think Syrian Catholics in Kerala ever encouraged their people to read the translated Bibles which were available. I have this fantastic story in my own family where I think my grandfather's brother, who was a member of one of the Catholic churches in Kaduthurthi, I guess, or Muttijira. So this gentleman was an avid reader of Bible because their parents, my great grandfather was part of the CMS, and his sons were avid readers of Bible. So what would happen is that when they left the CMS to join the Catholic Church for a number of other reasons, the priest over there came to know that this gentleman Mathai was reading Bible, and on a Sunday, this parish priest asked this man to go to his office, and there he beat up this man for reading Bible. So remember, this person used to read Bible largely because of their Protestant upbringing. But the Catholics never used to do that, and absolutely no for a Pulaya Catholic who would really dare to read the scriptures. So, therefore, what I want to say is that the reading has different located histories. And now, to come back to what my friend Ebenezer had asked. So, therefore, the kind of variant of Christianity that existed here, in spite of this absolutely interesting cultural transaction and translation of Syriac language and Syriac Bible, they didn't take this message because it's not something which they would have done. It remained as a privately muted kind of transaction within the communities, more in the nature of a ritual kind of thing, remained as something related to the rights of that particular congregation. Whereas when with the Protestantism, as we know, the dynamism becomes absolutely different, and there is that's an outgoing type of religious practice where people are encouraged to read. Your salvation depends on your personal connection with the Word of God. So therefore, Word of God becomes really significant over there. You need to read that. You need to interpret them. The classic Protestant position. Now, my last point. It's a very complicated question. Although the answer everybody knows, but the other question is that when it comes to prayers, the Protestants would say that, in fact, anthropologist Webb Kane, his Christian Modern book, begins with a statement about Protestant prayer. They would say that, well, what is so great about Catholic prayer? You just read these books, printed prayer books. And if you are really committed to your prayers, you should have extempore prayers. Don't look at this Book of Common Prayer, which is very important for the CMS and others. But for the Sumbanese Christians in Indonesia, they would say that, well, you forget about this. You should have acquired enough linguistic felicity to use the language, to use phrases, to use expressions, similes, metaphors, etc., in such a manner that the prayer comes out of you. That's where you are in communion with God. So this sort of ideas of Protestantism would presuppose, the individual agency as far as the whole project of salvation is concerned. This was not the way in which probably the Eastern tradition of Christianity thought about it, because it was not an evangelical kind of religion. It remained as another privileged social group in traditional Kerala. Now, the Protestantism and the subsequent 19th and 20th century histories become very different. Thank you.
The next question is just a second. From Sam Neshamani. Did missionary education really help the upper caste in Travancore? Or the missionary higher education in English helped the Dalits and backward into global transformation? Kindly reflect.
Yeah, this is a very interesting question. And I think the chairman is he is much more qualified than I am to give a better answer to this. So, but my feeling is that when it comes to the education of the untouchable caste in Travancore, most schools which were started for the untouchables, and I guess even during the 1940s, they would all be terminated at class 2. So if you go to the villages or backwater areas where you have Pulayas, Parayas, and similar caste living, the schools which were there would be terminated at class 2, and these are all vernacular schools. And now, so you find interestingly literacy developing. And now I checked some of the missionaries who were big educators here, and they themselves were of the opinion that, I'm talking more about the European missionaries here, their idea was to educate the Pulayas and Parayas to such an extent that they could read scriptures and nothing beyond that. But obviously, we know that if somebody knows reading, then whatever, remember, printed materials were not available in that manner at that point of time. But if someone could read, he could read anything, or she could read anything. Now, when it comes to English education, I think this was a big problem. Because right here in Kottayam, where I am situated now, as we go from my place to the city, the town, we have this Cambridge Nicholson Institution where the missionaries started English education, subsequent teacher training, or the old seminary where they taught Greek, Latin, English, and all that, or the CMS College in 1838, I guess. Although they have a different story about it now, the founding year they have changed, unfortunately. So all these institutions that were imparting English education would never admit Pulayas. And recently, Vinal wrote about it. In fact, one of those guys who is from, Trishur Palakkad border, his name was Cornelius Hutton, who was enrolled in the missionary school here for English education. And because of caste segregation, he went out of his mind, and somehow he escaped from Travancore and got enrolled at Malabar Christian College, and from where he finished his education. Then he became an ordained priest of Basel Evangelical Mission. Now, this is much written about case of a Pulaya man trying to learn English. Now, when I did archival research, I came across the English documents written by Pulayas or Parayas only in the late 20s, when the first thing I came across was the memorandum which was submitted by the Pambadi John Joseph. This was a memorandum which he submitted to British Parliament, demanding the protection of the rights of the Pulaya converts and Paraya converts to Christianity. So this is written in English. He himself wrote that. And then in the late 30s, 40s, I have come across some materials which, in fact, the untouchable Christians produced. And yeah, so we have in the archive, I mean, some of these I came across in British Library and so on, India Office. So other than that, we hardly come across anything I mean, written by the untouchable caste in English in right here in Kerala. So therefore, I think I always thought that one day I would write a social history of English in Kerala. So this is something which is really demanding. We need to know that I have written elsewhere about it. There was a lot of struggle against on this question. And towards the end of 19th century, when this question, this is my last point, was taken up for discussion in the CMS in Kottayam, the majority opinion was such that they said, don't give English to players. They would become uppish, they would become incredibly, out of mind. They could go out of joints with the reality and so on. Better you teach them this carpentry and how to wash clothes. And still today you have that carpentry school as you come from Kottayam town to old seminary, which was actually meant for players to be trained. Now this was a big debate. I followed the sort of minutes of those debates, and I found that only one missionary. This is, I think, my contextual reading of the sources would tell me that A.F. Painter, the British missionary who was in here, he said that, well, Pulayas need English. So other than that, none of these native missionaries, Syrian Christian missionaries were ready for that. And therefore, all the English institutions here remained completely, exclusionary, and they were all sealed off for the Pulayas. So we need to really look at what is English as far as these people are concerned. So we need actually, I always used to think that a social history of English in Kerala, maybe. Yeah, thank you.
Um, we have a comment in between which I missed. It was Ashish Alexander. Great points, Sanal Mohan. Enjoyed your comprehensive perspective uh, on neglected facts, especially how missionaries were not always agents of imperialism. So that was a comment. And we have a query from India. Christian missionary interfaces across Africa, South America, New Zealand, and East might be similar in terms of cultural context, mainly on social divisions, to call it as global Christianity. While contextualizing politics of social divisions and representations within the mission, don't you feel that opting a popular language for scripture translation had helped missionaries in their evangelical endeavors?
Thank you, Professor Sanal Mohan
Yeah.
and others. I'm sorry that
No.
I could not attend this whole thing completely, but nevertheless, what I heard was quite impressive. And, I think we can have a separate discussion on these issues later on, or even another webinar like this, on the more or less related subjects. I have a few questions, but I'm not going to ask them now. Okay.
I request you to send those questions to me so that
Yeah, I'll send it.
Yeah.
I'll send it to you. I'll
Yeah.
send it to you by
Yeah.
email.
Yeah, thank you. Rachel, are we done with?
Sir, this last query that I posed, only that.
Yeah,
And there is a comment to KCHR which I will respond to in the chat box.
Okay, so I do agree with that. See, the whole question of translation. In fact, one book which I'm reading about the Rapmin community in Papua New Guinea. It's all about translation into the different local languages. See, in fact, Papua New Guinea is a small place, but they do have a lot of languages. And then the Australian missionaries are engaged in translating Bible into English. And then you have all sorts of Protestant Christians out there, including the Seventh-day Adventists and so on. So this denominational war actually becomes a war of translation also. That's quite amazing, the kind of stories we read about it. And the same I have read about the Amazonia and all that, where indigenous people who have become Christians, and then the Bible getting translated into this. So therefore, I think the last part of the question about the translation is quite true. If that's what I heard, you see, the language becomes very much central in taking the scriptures to the people, and therefore then the local languages become something like a global language, because even if it is spoken by a small community in a small island, remember, so they bring in a whole range of situated histories elsewhere. Now, if you, this is my last point, if somebody reads the Old Testament in a local language in a very distant corner of the world, we should also think about, as historians and social scientists practicing in the field, to see how do they make sense of this. How do they connect themselves with these narratives, these stories, and what are the ways in which these stories could be sent across the board if you have a variety of languages over there. These are the kind of challenges, I think. I forgot the project that these Australian missionaries had, which is all about translation, actually. And there are scholars, anthropologists who work in this particular area. And I found those works as quite fascinating. Yeah.
So we have a couple of comments which I will send to you over by mail.
Yeah.
It's a response.
Yeah, please. Please do that.
May I request Professor Michael Taragan to.
Pardon?
No, you are not audible, Rachel.
I can't hear you.
Yeah.
We have come to an end of the question answer session. If there are no more queries, may I request Professor Michael Taragan to take over the proceedings again?
Yeah, I mean, I'm just taking over to complete it, and once again, cordially thank Professor Sanal Mohan for sparing his time to give such a interesting presentation, and also for everyone else who has attended this program. So, as I told you at the very beginning, I'm not yet very sure of my ground when I'm speaking electronically. That is because I'm a fairly old person, used to different kind of technology of communication. That apart, I thought there was a similarity between the theme that Sanal Mohan was speaking about and the exercise that we just had. There it was a language. We spoke of a globe which was which had a different meaning from what people were used to in their daily life. And here, I think we are on a platform, on a technological platform, which is also way beyond many people. Many people who are old and who are not digitalized and all that. So I think translation means translating not only the text, but it has to be translated in terms of different meanings, different understandings, different concepts, and I think a study of translations of the type that Sanal Mohan talked about is certainly welcome, and there could be other points which can be also raised. Anyway, I once again thank all of you and declare that this session has come to a close. Thank you.
Thank you very much.
So may I make a small announcement on behalf of KCHR? Our next webinar will be by Professor Istvan Purcell on the 15th of this month, a news perspective on 9th century Christian copper plates, the testimony of indirect text tradition. So again, we will send you out the details of that soon, but thank you everyone.
Rachel, hello? Can you hear me?
Yes, sir. Yes, sir.
So how are things?
Things are good, sir.
Say hi to everyone.
I will. I think almost everyone was here also from
Yeah, I
our
saw FO.